With era of lesbian love between two female prisoners. Part 1. The iron door slammed shut behind Nadia with a sound that seemed to swallow every version of her life that had existed before that moment. She was 31 years old, a former schoolteacher who had once stood in front of rows of small children and taught them that the world was good, that people were fair, and that justice always found its way home. She stood now in the center of a cold, concrete cell block that smelled of rust and bleach and something older, something that had no name but felt like the slow erasure of identity. And she understood with terrifying clarity that every belief she had ever held about fairness and goodness had been a story she had told herself to survive a world that had never actually promised her any of it. She had been convicted of a crime she did not commit. That truth sat in her chest like a stone she could not swallow and could not spit out. A colleague had stolen from the school's fund. A paper trail had been altered. A frightened man had pointed in her direction because she was easier to blame than the truth. And the justice system, overworked, underfunded, and deeply indifferent, had taken the path of least resistance and locked her away for 7 years. 7 years. She had been a woman who woke up every morning and made tea and corrected grammar exercises and called her mother on Sundays. Now she was inmate number 472, and the world outside had already begun to forget her name. The first weeks inside Harlow Women's Correctional Facility were a kind of violence that left no visible bruises. It was the violence of noise, doors banging and women screaming and correctional officers barking, instructions in tones that made it clear no one here was considered fully human. It was the violence of the food, tasteless and gray, eaten in a cafeteria, where the social geography was as dangerous and as clearly drawn as any battlefield. It was the violence of the nights, when the lights never fully went out and the sounds never fully stopped. And Nadia would lie on her narrow mattress and stare at the water-stained ceiling and feel herself becoming smaller, thinner, like a photograph left too long in the sun. She had been assigned a cell on the East Block, which housed the longer-term inmates, women who had learned how to carry their sentences in their bodies, the way other people carried grief, quietly, functionally, without letting it show too much on the surface. She was given a top bunk. The bottom bunk belonged to a woman who was not there when Nadia first arrived, who was apparently in the medical unit, and about whom the other women spoke in tones that mixed respect with something that Nadia could not quite identify in those early days. Curiosity, perhaps, or tenderness wrapped tightly inside caution. Her name was Celeste. Nadia learned this from a woman named Bertha, a broad-shouldered woman with kind eyes and a 20-year sentence who had taken it upon herself and with the quiet, purposeful generosity of someone who had once been, knew and remembered what that felt like, to help Nadia understand the unwritten rules of survival inside Harlow. Bertha said Celeste's name the way people say the name of a place they have loved and lost, with a particular softness that made the syllables feel precious. Celeste had been inside for 4 years. She had another 3 to go. She was, according to Bertha, the kind of person who made the walls feel less like walls. Nadia did not understand what that meant until the evening Celeste returned. She came back to the cell on a Thursday, moving slowly because of a healing rib injury, wearing her institutional gray clothing like someone who had long ago made peace with the indignity of it. She was tall, with dark brown skin and close-cropped natural hair and eyes that were the color of deep water, not blue, not quite black, but something in between that seemed to shift depending on how the light touched her. She stopped in the doorway when she saw Nadia sitting on the edge of the lower bunk. Nadia had not yet climbed up, had been waiting, unsure of the etiquette, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Celeste's face opened into an expression that was not quite a smile but was something warmer and more specific than simple politeness, and she nodded slowly as though confirming something she had already sensed, and she said that Nadia was welcome to use the lower bunk until her ribs healed if she needed more space to move in the night, and just like that, without ceremony or declaration, something began. It began as conversation, in a place where most communication was either transactional or performative, where words were weapons or walls or tools of negotiation, and the conversations between Nadia and Celeste were something genuinely different. something that felt almost transgressive in their honesty and their depth. Celeste had been a nurse before her incarceration. Convicted under circumstances she described only partially and only once, in a low voice, late at night when the block had finally quieted to its minimal hum. She had made a decision that she believed was right, a decision that had involved protecting a patient whose family had been harming her, and the law had not agreed with her methods, even if it privately understood her motives. She carried her conviction not with shame but with a complex, layered dignity that Nadia found almost unbearably moving, the dignity of someone who had examined their choices from every angle and still, in the end, could not have done otherwise. They talked about the lives they had left behind. Nadia described her classroom, the particular smell of chalk and citrus hand sanitizer and children's sneakers, the way certain students would look at her with an expression of absolute trust that had felt like the greatest responsibility and the greatest gift she had ever been given. Celeste described hospitals, the organized chaos of a busy ward, the intimacy of caring for a body in pain, the strange and particular privilege of being with someone in their most vulnerable moments. They talked about food they missed, about music they loved, about books they wished they could, access in the facility's painfully limited library. They talked about their mothers. They talked about loneliness, not the social loneliness of isolation, but the deeper, more existential loneliness of feeling fundamentally unseen by the world, of moving through life being told that your version of reality was somehow incorrect, somehow too much, somehow wrong. And somewhere inside all of that talking, something else began to grow. It was slow and it was quiet and it was nothing like what either of them had expected. And perhaps that was why neither of them tried to name it for a very long time. Nadia had never in her life used the word lesbian to describe herself. Not because she had been afraid of it, but because she had never had occasion to need it. She had loved men and only men, or believed she had been loving them when in truth she had perhaps only been performing the version of herself that the world around her had designed and expected. Inside Harlow, stripped of every performance, every costume, every carefully maintained external identity, she began to discover that there were chambers in herself she had never opened, rooms she had not known existed, full of a light she had no previous language for. Celeste knew herself better and had known herself longer, but she too had learned the discipline of silence, of keeping her truest self tucked away in the interior, because the exterior world had historically not been a safe place for all of her. What was developing between them was something she recognized and something she had been careful about for a long time. Careful the way you are careful with something fragile and irreplaceable, something you can only protect by holding it gently and being absolutely honest about both its weight and its worth. The prison around them was not kind. There were days when the cruelty of the system pressed down on both of them with a force that felt physical. Arbitrary punishments, indifferent officers, the grinding humiliation of being counted and processed, and reduced to a number over and over again. There were days when women in the block broke under pressures that were invisible to the outside world but catastrophic on the inside. There were incidents, tensions, moments of violence, both casual and deliberate. There were nights when the weight of unjust conviction settled on Nadia's chest with such density that she could barely breathe, when the thought of 6 more years felt less like a sentence and more like a death that had simply agreed to be slow about itself. On those nights it was Celeste's voice that reached her, not always with words, sometimes just with presence. The sound of steady breathing below her, the knowledge that someone in this gray and grinding place knew her real name, her actual name, not the number the institution had assigned her. Sometimes Celeste would reach up in the darkness and find Nadia's hand hanging over the edge of the bunk, and she would hold it, just hold it, with the same focused care she had once given to patients who were frightened and in pain, and that simple act of contact would somehow communicate everything that language could not carry, that she was seen, that she was real, that she mattered. Neither of them called it love yet. Love was a word that required courage, and courage inside Harlow was a resource that had to be conserved carefully, rationed and protected. But whatever it was, this thing growing between them in the cold fluorescent light of a correctional facility, in the margins of a system designed to diminish them. It was alive. It was warm. It was in a place defined by the systematic removal of all softness, something impossibly stubbornly soft. And that was the most dangerous and most beautiful thing either of them had encountered in years. If this story has touched something in you, if you have ever felt unseen, or unjustly judged, or found unexpected light in an unexpected place, please ask yourself whether you believe in kindness. If the answer is yes, then this story was made for you, and sharing it is one small way of putting more of that kindness into the world. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that even the most confined spaces cannot imprison the human heart. Before we close out today, drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever found genuine connection in a place or a moment you never expected? Your story matters and this community is listening. Part 2 is coming, and then what grows between Nadia and Celeste in the darkness will either save them both or cost them everything they have left. Stay close.